Okay, so what I'm wanting us to do in this last session is sort of wrap up with some reflections on how we use the Old Testament as Christians, paying attention to being sensitive to both the importance of these documents as part of the Christian Bible, but also sensitive to the fact that, end of the day, these are Jewish documents, not Christian documents. And we can go trampling through their garden patch with big wellies on, or we can try and be a bit more sensitive. But there are issues that cut in all kinds of directions about that. Earlier this year, I kicked off a series at the cathedral on why bother with the Old Testament. In fact, one of my sermon that night is on the website. But about the third night in, I guess it was a Jewish rabbi. No, actually not a Jewish rabbi, but a Jewish community worker. He had a rabbi there with him, but this other guy did the talking. And at one stage I asked him, so how do you feel as a Jewish person with the way we use your scriptures? And he wouldn't touch that question with a 40-foot barge pole. He went all around the shop and he was being all very interfaith sensitive and stuff, but at no point would he actually engage with the issue of, to what extent do they see us as kind of trespassing on their scripture. Now, part of that did come out, part of the dynamic came out as in the ongoing conversation, because he also made it clear in his other discussion that really Jewish people don't read the Bible, they read the Talmud. Okay? And when they do encounter biblical text, they always read it through the lens of the Talmud. And he gave a couple of examples of that. And so this is my summary, it's not his exact words, but his basic position was that to read the Bible undiluted, as it were, unfiltered, is in fact dangerous, and that you have to tone it down by reading it through the lens of the Talmud. So he says, in the scriptures it says that a death sentence can be issued for this, or must be issued for this, and this reason. In the Talmud it says if a death sentence is offered more than once in every 70 years, the court is being excessive. In other words, don't do it. So the Talmud is a kind of a framing of the earlier biblical text for life in the empire, for life in the Roman Empire and beyond, the Constantinian Empire.
Do all Jewish people do that, or are there extremists who, because it sounds a much more moderate, I don't know. Right?
Yeah, no, it's not so much the Orthodox practicing conservative, and there are as many denominations of Jews as there are Christians, okay, but Jewish friends of mine who are serious about practicing their faith, instead of doing a daily Bible reading, they do a daily Talmud reading. Okay? And it's that, and they're still reading the scripture, but they're reading the scripture through a lens, through a filter of commentary and conversation. So scripture is always experience located in a larger web of wisdom, not simply the raw text. Okay. Now, of course, in the synagogue they read Torah and Haftorah, the prophets, but in their actual practice and in their instruction, educational programs, they actually study Talmud. They're Talmudic scholars rather than biblical scholars. Yeah.
In your experience, through others who are practicing the Jewish religion, do they see Christianity as sort of like an heretical version of Judaism? What's their sort of lens they use?
Okay. That's a wonderful sidetrack. I'll be back in about 45 minutes on topic. No, it's good. For a while I served on the Australian Jewish Anglican Dialogue group. So there were 3 or 4 Anglicans and 3 or 4 Jews met on this group, at least once a year. And it was interesting. Now, for starters, they were not at all interested in talking about Jesus. I don't mean in let me tell you about Jesus, but I mean they just weren't interested in dealing with the Jesus thing. Okay. The other issue was that the conversation for them was primarily a community conversation between the Jewish community and the Anglican community. It was not an interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians. And they were interested in things like anti-Semitism and mixed marriages and various things like that. So that was an interesting experience as well. They and my other Jewish friends that I have, I'm thinking of one particular guy he's a professor, now retired professor of Western literature from Bar Ilan University near Tel Aviv, and he writes poetry about Jesus in Hebrew. Okay, and the way he explains it is, and I think some of my other Jewish friends would agree, for Jewish people one of the biggest identity challenges is what to do about Jesus and his friends, because their historical experience for the last 1500 years has been dominated by Christians who at the very best are suspicious, if not antagonistic, towards Jews. And so they're very happy to bracket us out of their frame of reference. Okay? And indeed they need to, in some ways, to define themselves. And that's another part of the Israel experience. How do you be Jewish in a country where the Jews are in charge? Now there's a new idea. Okay, that hasn't happened since 70 AD. And they haven't had much practice in doing that. Okay? And it's a tough act. How do you do this thing in a way which is Western, democratic, so understandably there are some Jewish scholars and leaders, rabbinic leaders, who certainly celebrate the commonalities of Christian and Jewish traditions and will celebrate Jesus as the most famous Jew and the most influential Jew in history. But it's that's the academic. They're the people who engage in interfaith dialogue as a kind of intellectual discipline. As a recreational pursuit for academics. The people who attend the Jewish congregation, they want to be Jewish. They don't want to worry about Jesus. Thank you very much. And that's different, I think, in Australia than in the northeast of the US, where the synagogue is a much more significant part of the local community. Like I think in some parts of the US, the synagogue is part of the interchurch council. That's not going to happen here, because neither side would be happy with that. So yeah, it's a different dynamic. But there is a group. There's the Australian Council for Christians and Jews, and they are a more explicitly theological and academic religion kind of forum, where they look at issues to do with the interface of Judaism and Christianity in our culture, including how do Christians talk about the Jewish scriptures? How do we talk about we don't stereotype Jews of Jesus' time as being legalistic Pharisees with all the baggage that term implies. Yeah, so it's and indeed the big existential agenda for most Jewish communities is the Holocaust and Israel. And that's understandable. If the exile was a major turning event for the people of ancient Judah, how much more so the Holocaust, the Shoah, and similarly the creation of Israel with all its pluses and minuses. It's a defining event for the future of Judaism. And it may actually be the destruction of Judaism. It may be the worst thing that's ever happened to Judaism, with the benefit of hindsight, but we're not yet having the benefit of hindsight. And and so it's very difficult to be involved in interfaith conversation with Jewish people, or even academic conversation with Jewish people, if you're seen as being in any way critical of Israel. Okay, so it is tricky. So academically it's theoretically possible, but in the real world of the local parish and synagogue it's less likely to happen. There's very little common community of interest. Someone was just... Yep. Right? Doesn't matter. Okay. All right. So let's just jump into this and see how far we get with the time we have. So what we call the Christian Old Testament is, of course, one variant of the Jewish Bible. And as I've said, the Jewish people read their scriptures through another lens provided by the Talmud. So the texts belong, first of all, to the Jews. Now that has historically been a difficult thing for Christian theologians to say. And I'm sure many of you will have known clergy and Sunday school teachers or whatever who will say, no, the Old Testament is all about Jesus. Actually, it's not. Okay? And there's another religious tradition that says these books are ours and we can read them from one end to the other and we never have any reason to think about Jesus. Okay? Because our filter, They might read the Old Testament, the Tanakh, through the Talmud, but we tend to read the Old Testament through Jesus. So we see Jesus everywhere. They don't, because they're not looking for him. Okay. So essentially these are Jewish documents of faith, and so I find it significant theologically that the Jewish voice has a primary contribution to make to the texture of the Christian Bible. And I don't want to pasteurize them into becoming anonymous Christians. I want them to be robust Jewish documents which are part of a totality of Christian theology, and not simply to colonize the Old Testament. So it raises some of these interfaith issues that Jeff was alluding to, and what I want to think a little bit about are the ways in which the Old Testament, the Tanakh, might function within Christianity. And this of course gets to the views that Judaism and Christianity have of each other. Okay? And they're primarily been views of disparity of power. And now in Israel it's just simply reversed the other way around in terms of the local Christian community. So I'm not going to be somebody who's going to adopt the Marcionite solution. And for those who haven't yet done the rise of Christianity, Marcion was a leader in the early church around about 130, 140, so around the middle of the 2nd century, and he developed a particularly anti-Jewish way of dealing with Scripture. Okay, and he was not alone. He represented a widespread antipathy towards Judaism around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is what you would expect. These people were bad for the neighbourhood, bad for taxation. We're getting caught up in some of the hostility because they just won't settle down and get used to it. So, not surprisingly, in the 50 or 60 years between the destruction of Jerusalem and the Bar Kokhba revolt, not only are Christians, in a sense, coming out of the closet and identifying as different from Jewish, but they're also wanting to distinguish themselves and not be mistaken for Jews, given that there have been repeated uprisings with the need to Rome to suppress. So there's an antipathy towards Judaism around the beginning of the 2nd century, and Marcion is the most, if you like, classic and extreme systematic version of that. Equally, so in his view, the God of the Old Testament was not the God of Jesus. And so he wanted to get rid of the Jewish scriptures altogether, and he had a version of the gospel which he had inherited called the Evangelion, which is rather like Luke but not quite the same as Luke, and he kept the letters of Paul and nothing else. But actually Marcion probably invented the New Testament. Okay, he's the first person to put out a definitive list of what would be the Christian Bible, and while his proposal was voted down, the response to Marcion gave us the Bible we have. So Marcion not only published in effect the first New Testament, but he lost. But in losing, he generated a movement which gave us the Bible that we have. So Marcion is significant, but he was thoroughly anti-Jewish in a very explicit way. The more common way to get rid of Jewish issues within the life of the church is what we call supersessionism, which basically says you're last year's model and we are this year's model, and obviously we're an improvement. Okay? You're violent, we're peaceful. Really? Read the Crusades, read the wars of Christians against Christians, read the history of Europe for the last 500 years, read the 20th century, read the Spanish conquest of South America, but we're non-violent, we're peaceful, we're loving, gentle people. Okay? Well, clearly we're not. But one of the ways was to say that, in God's purposes, Israel has fulfilled its purpose and is now redundant, and God has moved on with the new Israel, and that's us. Now, I'm not going there either. I don't want that version, that sort of nasty version of putting the Jews in their place and making them. Because one of the downsides of that historically is, well, if that's the case, you either persecute them or you try to force them to convert, because clearly they're mistaken. And not only that, they're out of step with God, so for their own sake we should really force them to become Christians. They'll be better off. Okay? And Christians have dealt with Jews like that over the years. So we need a more nuanced perspective, one might suggest. Okay. So one of the ways people might get into this is through a discipline called Old Testament theology, which I actually think is a problematic concept in its own right. But it's really saying, what is the theological perspective of the Old Testament? And people like Von Rad, this was a very popular thing in the middle of the 20th century, and still popular in more conservative, if you like, Christian circles. My difficulty with it is that I tend to emphasize the diversity of the Jewish documents in the Old Testament rather than harmonizing things into a Christ-focused theology which is consistent through the Old Testament. So I have a problem with the very project of Old Testament theology. But people who get into Old Testament theology are basically working from an assumption about the relationship between the Old and the New Testament as parts of the Christian Bible, and the God who gave us Jesus is the God who's speaking through the Old Testament, and he has the same message, and it's a he, okay, all the way through. And so you simply you squash the Old Testament, squeeze the Old Testament into a template provided by your own favourite Christian theology, whatever that happens to be. And so there are wider issues there about what kind of a thing we think the Bible is and how we think the authority of the Bible is going to be experienced. Okay? So there's no question that the Bible's authoritative. The issue is, what does that mean to say that the Bible's authoritative? The Bible is not a book of, I would say, the Bible is not a book of answers, but it's more like a set of exercises. And some of the exercises work out, and some of the exercises are not particularly relevant to the situation we're in at the moment. But that's just a different model. So among the things we'll be playing with will be, and this was a point that Valdemar raised earlier, and it's a pity he's had to leave, but one of the issues is, so what do we do about the divine origins of the Bible as you know, some parts of the tradition? And this is, of course, a variant of ideas about inspiration and what we think that might mean, to talk about, you know, the authors of the Bible being inspired by God, and how does that correlate with the readers of the Bible being inspired by God? At what point do we locate the presence and the activity of God? Now, some key New Testament texts that tend to focus on God's activity in generating and shaping and giving us the Bible would be the 2 Timothy 3 passage, a passage in 2 Peter chapter 1, and interestingly, passage at the end of 2 Peter, which talks about the letters of Paul and how there are some bits in there that are really difficult to understand. Okay, but the learned and the unlearned and the unstable, the ignorant and the unstable, twist the letters of Paul to their own destruction, just as they do the other scriptures. So in the mind of the author of 2 Peter, the letters of Paul are already in the category of scripture and are having the same problems of being misused by people of faith. You'd like to say people of goodwill, but that's not always the case. So there's somewhere as we think about this, we're going to have to work out where we locate God and God's activity, God's presence in the phenomenon of Scripture. Is it at and only at the creation of the document? Is it in the reception of the documents? Is it in the transmission and preservation of the documents? Is it in the reading of the documents now? Okay? And so there are hard and soft versions of inspiration, depending where you stand on that theological spectrum. And they each have their positive and negative dimensions. I don't think there's a laydown is there for that one. Another approach to the authority of Scripture and so on is to talk about, but there are things that happen in the Bible which are unique and miraculous. They've never happened anywhere else, and that proves that the Bible is true and authoritative. And that's of course the religious version of my myth is better than your myth, my daddy's bigger than your daddy, etc. Okay? Because it's claiming privileges and status for the traditions we value and diminishing similar claims made by other people's traditions. Okay? And that worked pretty well when everybody in the village was Christian. It gets a bit less comfortable when the family living next door are Muslim or Jewish or whatever. or the kids in the preschool, or wherever it happens to be. There's a, and of course this is where the deconstructive effect of historical critical studies becomes theologically significant, because at this stage, generally speaking, the net impact of historical analysis of the Old Testament world and the composition and history of the text is tending to undermine the uniqueness and even the historicity of these events. Okay? And we notice that actually other people have very similar stories which we don't take seriously or literally, but we want ours to be taken very seriously and very literally. So what's going on there? Okay? So a classic text there would be the passage, the first paragraph or so in 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul is describing or referring to the Exodus and wilderness experience of the people of Israel, how they got into trouble, and most of them died in the desert, and he says, this all happened to them so it could be a lesson to us. Really? Like, it didn't happen to them because they were bad or because they deserved it or just because it happened to them because they were in the wrong place at the right time. All these terrible events, including the total destruction of an entire generation of Israelites, were so we could have a lesson. You see, there's an abstract theological view of history that I think becomes dehumanized. And I can sort of see what Paul is getting at, but if we take that too literally, we get a pretty nasty view of people's circumstances. That's the same passage, by the way, where Paul says, they were wandering through the desert, and the rock which followed them was Christ. Okay? And of course he's drawing on rabbinic traditions, or what would become rabbinic traditions, that Moses didn't just crack the rock once and lots of water to drink for 2 million people, and then they went a couple of days' journey, he cracked open another rock and there's water flowing everywhere for 2 million people. Because by the time you do that for 40 years, the desert is blooming. There are leaking rocks all over the desert, and the place is green as. Okay, now clearly that's not going to work. So in the Jewish tradition, the answer was this one magical rock that God pointed out to Moses followed them through the desert. Oops, they're moving. Ding, 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 ding. So the rock gets up and followed them. Okay, like a watering truck. Keeps every time they camp, in comes the magic rock. Right now, okay, we laugh at it, but that's a tradition Paul took literally. And then he not only takes it literally, he spiritualizes and says, that rock that followed them through the desert, it was really Jesus. It was Christ. Come on, Paul. What are you eating? What are you drinking? What are you smoking? Okay, but we can see how the story is working. Okay, it's not meant to be taken literally. It's symbolic language, and he's saying, just as the rock sustained them in that legend of the rock turning up every time they move camp, so Christ is the one who travels with us. And indeed, in a sense, it was Christ who was providing their needs in the wilderness. That's the kind of point he's making, but he's doing it in a way that we don't find persuasive as a way of thinking. But the Bible's full of that kind of stuff. So when do we take it literally? When do we take it symbolically? When do we just say, that's a really interesting story? I wonder if other peoples have similar stories, or if we should generate a new story, for now. So we will take seriously in some way this idea that God is involved in this phenomenon called the emergence of Scripture. We're probably going to have to stand back a bit, I suggest, from the kind of harder historical readings of the story. And one of the ways we do that is we say, well, ultimately, the books that are sacred to us are the books which were chosen to be read by the synagogue and the church. And it's not our choice. We don't get to change the list. We don't get to vote. And we don't get to change our grandparents. That's just what it is. Okay? And that's not much different from me saying a couple of hours ago, in effect, the books that were used by the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem became the de facto canon of the Jewish community at the time. And yes, there's a bit of argument around the edges about Esther and Song of Songs and so on, but there was no big argument. That basically, if it was approved for use in the temple, that was it. So, of course, when there's no longer a temple, that authorization moves to the synagogue communities, and so it's going to be expressed in the Mishnah and the Talmud and the readings that are set in the lectionary. And at least from the 2nd, 3rd century, possibly even the 1st century, there's a kind of we think, already a kind of lectionary sequence for readings in the synagogue. So these are the documents that were generated in formative periods, and the significant thing is the Second Temple period, from the beginning of the Persian Empire to the advent of the Roman Empire, is a time when it's back to the drawing boards for the people of God. And they come out of that period of about 500 or so years with two models. One model is Torah observant Judaism, and the other model is the Christ community. And both early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are the offshoots of Second Temple Judaism. Okay? And they're two separate ways, related but different answers to the question, how do we be the people of God in a world run by other people's gods? Okay? And rulers and so on. So these are the documents both for Jews and for Christians. These documents come out of a formative and generative period, and they are therefore foundational texts, not because they're historically accurate, but because these are the texts that shaped our grandparents, as in 2,000 years ago, grandparents. These are the texts that set the DNA for the Jewish religious tradition and for the Christian religious tradition. And so they're authoritative. And we can invent legends and stories about how inspired and magical and unique and so on. The real ultimate answer is reread these books because the Christians before us read these books. And it's a tradition we receive. And one of the interesting things there, of course, is that the Septuagint was the version of the Bible that was known to Paul, for sure, because he quotes in Greek. And if Jesus was literate at all, and even knew what a Bible was, it would have been something more like the Septuagint. Okay? Although whether he was literate in Greek, or only in Aramaic or Hebrew, we don't know enough about Jesus to be sure. But certainly what we call the Old Testament, more or less in its Septuagint form, that was the Bible. When Christianity was born, yes, there was a Bible in the cradle, and guess what? It was the Septuagint. Because the early Christians were Greek-speaking Jews. Okay? Every early Christian document that we know of was composed in Greek. So these are people who dream in Greek. They think in Greek, they imagine in Greek, they argue in Greek. So, Christianity is very much a phenomenon of the Jewish diaspora, even though its origins are in the Galilean Jesus. So again, there's another one of those black boxes. Okay, we don't know how you get from a Galilean Jesus to a diaspora Christianity. What we do know is that after Easter, Galilee gets forgotten. You would never figure from reading the letters of the New Testament or the book of Acts or the book of Revelation, you would never figure that there was anything to do with Galilee, that Christianity had anything to do with Galilee. It's just like gone. It's an interesting box. So one of the things that people experience when they get into biblical studies, and you might have noticed this yourself, is that there's a kind of a collapse of the grand narrative. The Bible kind of tends to come apart in our hands, and critical scholarship deconstructs the biblical text, and we lose something of the capacity of the Bible to be the great narrative. Okay, whether it's from creation through, or whether it's from Abraham through, or whether it's from Exodus through, or whether it's from David through, people like me that embrace that sort of critical scholarship end up saying, what do I do with the bits that are left over? What do I do with this now? How do I make it work? Okay. So any suggestion to me that the Old Testament hangs together with some big theological idea that holds it all together, and if we just teach people that, wouldn't it be cool? To me, that doesn't work. So where do we get the theological coherence? And this all, of course, fits in with the loss of the Western meta-narrative more generally as we move into in and through the postmodern period. So if the Bible is losing its coherence, if it's fragmenting, if we're losing our big meta-narrative, then how is the Bible relevant and why should we bother with it anyway. Okay. Well, I hope you've already seen, even in today's stuff we've done, that there's more than enough. There are times when we engage with the biblical text, even at a fairly, meta level, high level, and it's so obviously relevant to who we are, to questions of identity, the questions of faithfulness, the questions of celebration and mission and so on. I mean, to me, it's not an arguable position. The Bible is obviously relevant, but it seems to me it's also got to be done in ways which are constructive and end up with outcomes that are generous and beneficial. So there are people though who will respond by saying, no, it's all about coherence. The Bible coheres, and the Old Testament is all about Jesus. The Old Testament is about Christ.
Sorry, I was
Oh, it's all right. I thought you were saying, before you go too fast. Okay. So the question for me, of course, are they identifying coherence, or are they imposing a coherence so it all makes sense and reassures and reaffirms and stabilizes what they already believe? And that I suspect, for me at least, that would be my potential critique of biblical theology as a discipline. Okay, that it's attempting to come up with a single coherent message from the Bible rather than deal with the messiness of the Bible. And that's also becomes the case when you've got sort of confessional or particular theological, whether it's we want an evangelical approach to the Bible, or we want a liberal, or we want an Anglican or a Catholic or a Lutheran approach to the Bible. Why don't we just read the Bible and see what comes out of the process? We might have to rethink our Anglicanism or our Lutheranism or our evangelicalism as we actually read with what's there, engage with what's there. But and that was certainly one of the challenges around the Bible 360 project. Do we actually try to offer people what the Anglican Church believes about the Bible? Okay, that's almost a quote. Or do we say, oh, you've got to be kidding, what the Anglican Church believes about anything in one sentence? Okay, we're a diverse community. So when it comes to the Bible, what are we going to do there? How do we do it? So I have a modest proposal. I guess my way of dealing with, and I did a slightly different version of this a few days ago at Linda's farm, where I actually used a different set of themes, but that's okay. The point is, I don't have the answer, but I think the answer lies somewhere along these lines. Okay. So rather than looking for a single big idea, a silver bullet to solve the problem, let's look at the headline ideas, the big ideas that maybe are the cluster that we take out of these biblical documents, the Old Testament documents. One of them, I'm sure, is identity, the issue of identity, and of course in the Old Testament that's about Jewishness. Being Jewish and being, of course, descendant of Abraham, chosen people, all that sort of stuff. Now, that's going to be an issue that Christians engage with differently than a Jewish person would engage with it. Okay? But issues of identity, and in particular Jewish identity. And certainly one of the challenges for us as Christians is, how do we affirm Jewish identity rather than undermine it? Okay? Should we actually be trying to convert Jews to Christianity, or should we be celebrating their Jewishness and not trying to convert them? I know what the Jewish people will tell us, but how do we see that issue? Related issue, of course, is covenant, which is the idea that there's a relationship, a covenantal relationship between this particular people and God. Now, even if we extrapolate out to a covenant with the Christian community, what's the market value of covenant? What does it actually mean in real life? Does that mean I can take someone else's land and it's okay because I'm God's covenant people? Okay. Does it mean I can do this, I can do that? So what does covenant mean? And to what extent is covenant a privilege, and to what extent is covenant a responsibility? And I actually think that's what Torah plays into. Okay. But covenant. Lifestyle. One of the things about being Jewish, and certainly one of the things about the Old Testament, that is not actually a matter of what you believe, it's more a matter of how you act. Okay? And that doesn't have to get down to, unless you've done the 23 things that are required before morning tea, you've got a black mark. But Jewish identity is more about practice than it is about belief. Okay? So how do we deal with that sort of stuff when for Christians, orthodoxy has been around agreement on questions of faith? Okay? So where do we see the core of holiness, and to what extent do we allow differentiation and difference? The question of land is also really important in the Old Testament, and it's really important in contemporary Israel and Palestine as well. There was a fairly controversial paper given to a conference in Jerusalem in, I guess, 2004, so 10 years ago, by the then Archbishop of Canterbury's representative. The Archbishop of Canterbury was going to come to speak at the conference, and he was lent on by the Jewish leadership in Britain not to come to this Palestinian Christian conference. But he sent his representative to read his speech. And so in the context of Rowan not turning up and then having his representative read a speech which talked about the gift of the land to the Jewish people by God, that guy had a tough gig, okay, as he read the paper. And boy, did he get worked over in the corridor over the next couple of days as we developed a response to that paper. But the point that Rowan Williams was making, and it wasn't an easy point for the Palestinian Christians to hear, was that one of the things we'd want to affirm out of the biblical legacy is that there's something important about having a real place to practice one's faith. Now, of course, the obvious answer is fine, but don't take my house. Okay, so allowing for issues of justice and dispossession and so on. But his basic point was the Jewish people cannot be the Jewish people and cannot fulfill their part in God's mission if they don't have a place to call home. Okay, and that place is going to be Palestine. And yes, we had to find ways that it's shared in justice and without violence either way. Okay, so the issue of land is not a question of privilege, but an issue of mission. Okay. Now, because these things do not just translate easily into Christian practice, but I'm seeing these as the major kind of themes in the Jewish scriptures. Okay. So identity, which is about Jewishness and chosenness; covenant, which is about being the chosen people in relationship with God; lifestyle, which is how you act, what you eat, and who you eat with, are more important than what you think about God. Okay, interesting. And land. And how would one enjoy the land in ways which are a blessing to others and do not leave them either landless or hopeless? Okay. And certainly that's an issue for us in this country as we think about our relationship with the indigenous people. And that's one reason for being very cautious in criticising Israel. It doesn't mean that Israel gets away without being criticised, but as an Australian, I don't have too many fingers left to point, okay, by the time I notice what my people have done. And then there's the idea of justice, a big theme, it seems to me, in the Old Testament, and it really goes to the core of the message of the prophets. It's about justice. And justice is not about punishing people. Justice is about making things right. Okay? So the Minister for Justice is actually about locking people up in prison. Okay? But where's the ministry of making things right? Where's the ministry of reconciliation? Where's the ministry of restoration? Where's the ministry of opportunity? Those kind of things. Yeah, that's right. Where are the budget priorities relative to this stuff? Okay. So again, that's a challenge as people of faith. As we're reading the Old Testament, we're reading it as Christians, but we're reading it as Christians with hopefully ears that are sensitive to the Jewish accent in these texts. Okay. That is not for us to tell the Jews how they should go about practicing justice, but it may be for us to notice that the scriptures we share with the Jews call us to be people of justice, as well as people of covenant, as well as people with identity. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things is that list has nothing to do with sin and forgiveness. Okay? It's very little to do with belief, other than being loyal to one God, but that didn't exclude other gods. It just said, well, Yahweh, it's you and me. I don't know about them, but as far as you and I are concerned, we're together. So it's not about challenging other people's beliefs, and it's not about believing certain things, and it's not about being caught up with a sense of sin, let alone original sin, which needs to be taken away by some sacrifice on a cross. Okay? None of that stuff will be found in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, that's not to say some Christians don't find it in the Old Testament, but people reading the Old Testament from a Jewish perspective don't see that present there at all. Sure, people do things wrong, they get punished, they admit their mistakes, and they move on. Okay? Make a sacrifice, whatever, and make some restitution to the victim. Okay? They don't just say a prayer and it's all forgiven. Okay, there's a bit more to it, but it's not the fascination or the obsession with sin and guilt. Okay, so we're not going to get through the whole of this, but let me just try and wrap up the last couple of minutes, and then the rest you can just... A lot of what I'm doing in the latter part of this session is actually in the towards the end of the first chapter in the Once and Future Scriptures, which was such a hot ticket item at last year's synod. Okay, so we've got to have a lot more in our toolbox than just the historical critical method. And there's much more than the historical critical method which is causing us to rethink our attitude to the Bible. But one of the challenges is, in fact, even the way we read the Bible now tells us we've got to rethink the place of the Bible, particularly the place of the Old Testament within Christian theology. But there's also the challenges that come because of the increased knowledge we have these days, whether it's about cosmology, history of the universe, whether it's about DNA and the sort of Human Genome Project, whether it's medical insights, whether it's psychological insights, etc. Our sense of what it means to be alive and to be human is entirely different than it was 2,000 years ago, but even probably 200 years ago. Okay, so our theology and our reading of Scripture presumably has to catch up with that. The challenges that come out of the historical stuff, and of course there are the challenges that come out of the ethical and moral stuff, which is everything from the pervasive gender bias through to ethnic cleansing. Okay, and that's not an Old Testament problem, that's a biblical problem. Okay, and if the answer to the world's problems is for God to arrange for Jesus to be crucified on the cross, have we got the question right in the first place? Okay, or do we need to rethink even the significance of the crucifixion? Bear in mind, the Church has never defined its theology of atonement, so I did not just make myself liable for a heresy trial. Okay? We've defined the nature of God and we've defined the nature of Jesus. We've never defined the nature of the Bible, and we've never defined in what sense the death of Jesus is in any way a saving event. That's been one of the mysteries that's been left unresolved, thankfully. Okay? That's not to say we don't all know what everybody thinks, but what everybody thinks is not necessarily what Christians should believe. So there are ethical and moral dilemmas very much at the heart of our faith. And then, of course, there are issues to do with our relationship with communities of other faiths. And in our kind of world, it's not just what we do about the boat people, it's what we do, it's how open we are to people of difference. And so we have a significant set of challenges, and I guess the final one I want to mention is that in the way we now understand how literature works and how we make meaning out of our engagement with various kinds of information, communication theory, we have moved long past the idea that God uses words to reveal truth. Okay, the Bible is literature, so words are being used. Okay, but propositional theories about Revelation are really not going to stand up in today's world. They're sort of yesterday's, not even yesterday's, they're the day before yesterday approach to these kind of questions. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think I don't want to go on to a whole new section. Okay, yeah, no, I won't go on to the next section. Let's just take some questions and discussion as we kind of wrap it up at this point. Got about 5 minutes or so left, because the next bit will be a whole new part of the conversation. And most of that you can pick up in that chapter from Once and Future Scripture. Just ready to go home.
Challenge of how to preach from the Old Testament.
Yeah, so then, yeah, sure, how to preach and how to do all sorts of things. But actually, I think it's just what I find works when I'm in parishes and when I'm preaching as a guest preacher and so on, is just to be open about how I'm approaching the text. And not to give people the idea that everything in the Bible is assumed by theologians to be literally historically correct. Many of what appear to be the most conservative people sitting in the pews are actually thinking and reading much more widely than we recognise, but they don't think it's safe to express any questions or any doubts. I was I told this story in another class, but a couple of weeks ago now, my mother asked for yet another copy of my last book. She's one of my best customers. She's living at a retirement village at Aveo, and I'm not unknown at that village because I've done various things there over the years, and I'm not without my critics at that village. But there are a number of people who keep asking, how's Gregory doing, and can we get this book or that book anyway? So she asked me to get an extra copy for this particular person. And this person actually had been in my congregation at Forest Lake, which is the next suburb, when I first went there in 2003. And a year or two later, retired into Aveo. And when she realised that my mother had moved in to the village and they started chatting at church and so on, her comment was, and this is, for me as a priest, this is like the best kind of endorsement, she just said, he was the first priest that ever made any sense. Now, she never gave me a hint of that in the time that I knew her at Forest Lake, and I would never put her on a short list until now, a short list of people who thought, that who were one of my fans. I thought she was probably a little bit even standoffish, not particularly approachable. But there was something about my approach to preaching and liturgy and so on that she really thought made sense and was refreshing. So I dutifully dropped a copy of the book around to their unit, and sadly she'd just been taken back into hospital because she's not at all well. But her daughter was there, and she said, what's your name? Oh, Greg. Yes, Mum talks about you all the time. Wow. Okay. That's what ministry is about. And so it's about being open, gentle, taking people with you, not trashing their faith. But also, like, if I preach on Adam and Eve, I would always make it clear from my choice of words that so in this story about Adam and Eve, okay? I'm never talking about Adam and Eve as real characters, but as in this story, God is inviting us, church is inviting us, that kind of thing. All right, I take it from all the shut electrical devices that you're ready to go home, and I'm just getting started. No, okay. All right, okay. So I do look forward to your exegesis papers. If you've got any queries, run them past me. As I said, my preference is not to read a draft, but for you to send me an outline of your big picture ideas, that I'm going to look at these 6 points in the first section, and then I'm going to look at these points. Have I missed anything? I find it difficult to contribute to the drafting of the text without becoming a co-author and then stand back and mark it and say, why didn't you talk about blah? Well, why didn't you tell me to mention it, Turkey? So so feel free to send me an outline or dot points and I can comment on that, but I don't feel comfortable commenting on kind of fully worked up drafts.
When would be the last point at which you'd want to receive that? Because I think in the outline it actually said a few weeks ago.
The outline. Oh, yeah. Well, I really do want the essays coming in by the 1st of June because I'm on in case I haven't mentioned it, I'm on the plane in 3 weeks' time.
Check out when we're up to
Should be next week, really, or early in the next week,
Okay.
if you can.